The stagecoach came apart at the wheel 3 miles outside Willow Creek, and it was that broken wheel, more than anything written in the letters folded inside her carpetbag, that first taught Fannie Blackwell what kind of country she had come to marry into. She had left Springfield, Missouri, in the spring of 1879, with $61 sewn into the hem of her traveling dress. A black mourning bonnet she no longer had cause to wear but could not bring herself to leave behind, and a single letter from a rancher named Clarence Monroe that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Her father had died owing more than the little dry goods store could ever pay back, and after the bank men came and took the shelves and the scale and even the bell above the door, there had been nothing left in Missouri for a woman of 24 with no husband and no living kin. She had seen the advertisement in the back pages of the matrimonial news, tucked between a notice for a widower in Kansas seeking a housekeeper wife and another from a miner in Colorado who wanted, in his own words, a woman who did not mind snow. Clarence Monroe's notice had been shorter than the rest. Rancher, 32 years, Montana Territory, seeks a wife of good character. Must not be afraid of hard work or quiet. She had written back that she was afraid of neither, which was, she would later admit, only half true. Now she stood on the rutted road with the sun already hot on the back of her neck, watching the driver and a boy who had ridden shotgun try to lever the coach up with a fence post, while the other 3 passengers grumbled about the delay. Fannie did not grumble. She had learned in the months since her father's funeral that grumbling changed nothing and only used up breath a person might need later. She walked instead to the shade of a lone cottonwood, sat on a flat gray stone, and looked out at the land that was to be her home. It did not look like anything she had imagined. She had pictured, foolishly, something closer to the illustrations in the newspapers, all jagged red rock and painted sunsets. What she saw instead was grass, more grass than she had known existed, rolling pale gold to a line of blue mountains so far off they might have been clouds. The wind never stopped. It moved through the grass in long silver waves, and somewhere far off a hawk was crying, and Fannie Blackwell, sitting on her stone in her travel-worn dress, felt for the first time since her father's death something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to touch it. The wheel took 2 hours to mend. By the time the coach rolled into Willow Creek, the sun had gone low and orange, laying long shadows across the single dirt street with its handful of clapboard buildings, its saloon, its church with a bell tower no taller than a man standing on another man's shoulders, and its mercantile with a hand-painted sign reading BLACKSTONE and Son, General Goods. A man was waiting at the edge of the boardwalk in front of the stage office, hat in his hands, and Fannie knew him before the driver called out his name, because she had carried his photograph, a small tintype sent with his 3rd letter, pressed between the pages of her Bible for 2,000 miles. Clarence Monroe was taller than she had pictured, and thinner, with a face that had been handsome once and was handsome still, though weathered now in a way that made him look older than his 32 years. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky, and when they found her stepping down from the coach, something moved behind them quick as a fish beneath ice and was gone before she could name it. "Miss Blackwell," he said, and it was not a question. "Mr. Monroe." She held out her gloved hand, and he looked at it a moment too long before he took it, as though he had forgotten the custom, or had not shaken a woman's hand in a very long time. "The Reverend Hall is expecting us at the church," he said, "if you are not too tired from the road." "I am tired," she said honestly, "but I did not come 2,000 miles to keep a reverend waiting." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth and vanished just as quickly, and he picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, and that was the whole of their courtship, such as it had been. A handful of letters, a tintype photograph, a broken wheel, and now a walk down a dirt street toward a church with a bell no taller than a man. The ceremony itself took less time than the mending of the wheel had. Reverend Hall was an elderly man with kind eyes and spectacles that had been mended with wire, and his wife stood as witness alongside a rancher named Otis Prout, who Fannie gathered was a neighbor of Clarence's. The vows were the old familiar words, and Fannie said hers steadily, though her voice shook a little on the word obey, not from doubt but from the strangeness of promising anything at all to a man she had known for perhaps 4 hours. Clarence said his own vows low and even, and when the moment came to place the ring, a thin band of gold that had clearly been sized for a smaller finger than her own, his hands were not quite steady either. "It was my mother's ring," he said afterward, as they walked out into the blue evening, the church bell ringing thin and clear behind them. "I had it sized as best the blacksmith could manage. I am sorry if it does not fit well." "It fits well enough," Fannie said, though it did not, and she would spend the coming weeks turning it on her finger to keep it from sliding loose, a small private joke she did not yet feel close enough to share with him. They rode out to the ranch in a wagon behind a pair of sturdy bay horses, the last light draining out of the sky, and the first stars coming hard and bright the way they did in country with no lamps to dim them. Clarence did not speak much on the ride, and Fannie, watching his profile against the darkening sky, found she did not mind the silence as much as she had expected to. There was something in it that felt less like coldness and more like a held breath, though she could not have said why she thought so. The house, when they reached it, sat low and long against a rise of ground, a good solid ranch house of hewn logs and a shingled roof, with a barn behind it and corrals beyond that, and past the corrals the dark shapes of grazing cattle scattered like spilled stones across the hillside. A lamp burned in the kitchen window, tended, Clarence explained, by a Cheyenne woman named Little Bird Woman who came twice a week to cook and clean, and who had already laid out a supper of beans and cornbread and left it warming on the stove before returning to her own family's camp along the creek. "She has been kind to me," Clarence said, as he carried Fannie's trunk up the porch steps. "More kind than I deserved most days." Fannie did not ask what he meant by that. She would learn it soon enough, though not from him. The house was clean but spare, the kind of clean that came from a woman who dusted and swept out of habit rather than pride, and Fannie noted, as she stepped inside behind her new husband, that the front room was dim despite the hour, dimmer than it should have been with a lamp lit only a few feet away. It took her a moment in the shadowed light to understand why. The front window, a wide, good window facing east toward the road and the rising sun, was shuttered from the inside, the curtains drawn tight and pinned at the edges with small nails, as though someone had gone to some trouble to make certain no light, and no draft could pass through it at all. She said nothing of it that first night. There was too much else to take in. The small back bedroom that would be hers, plainly furnished but clean, with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern folded at the foot of the bed. Clarence's own quiet explanation, delivered without meeting her eyes, that he thought it best they take separate rooms for the present, until such a time as they came to know one another better. The strange, hollow ache of eating a meal across a table from a stranger who was now, by law and by God, her husband. She lay awake a long while that night listening to the wind move around the corners of the house and the far-off lowing of cattle, and she thought of the shuttered window in the front room, and wondered what a man could be keeping out, or keeping in, that required so much nailing shut. She found out 3 days later, from Otis Prout's wife, Delphine, who came calling with a basket of early rhubarb and a great deal more curiosity than manners. "You will forgive me for asking," Delphine said, settling herself at the kitchen table as though she had been invited to stay the afternoon, which she had not. "But has Clarence told you about Sarah?" Fannie, who had been slicing the rhubarb for a pie, went still with the knife in her hand. "He has not," she said carefully. "Who is Sarah?" Delphine's eyebrows rose, and Fannie understood at once that she had just handed the other woman a gift more precious than rhubarb. "His first wife," Delphine said. "Married 3 years before you, she was. A sweet thing, quiet, came out from Ohio, same as you're from Missouri, I believe. She died birthing their first child. The baby did not live either. It was a terrible thing. Clarence was never the same after. I am sorry to hear it, Fannie said, and meant it, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. He shut up the front room after, Delphine went on, warming to her subject now, the way people do when they have found an audience for a story they have told many times before. Sarah used to sit at that window every morning with her sewing, like the morning light on her hands, she said. After she passed, Clarence nailed the curtains shut. Hasn't opened that window in 3 years, not once, not even in the hottest part of summer. Otis has tried to talk sense into him about it, says a closed-up room breeds must and mold, but Clarence will not hear of it. I expect he thinks opening it would be like forgetting her. Fannie set down the knife very carefully because her hands had begun to shake and she did not want Delphine Prout to see it. Thank you for telling me, she said. I would rather have heard it from someone than stumbled into it blind. Well, Delphine reached for a piece of rhubarb and ate it raw, wincing at the sourness. I thought you ought to know what sort of house you've married into. It is not my place to say more than that, but I will say this much. You are a braver woman than I would have been, coming all this way to marry a man you never laid eyes on, into a house with a dead wife's ghost still sitting in the front room. Fannie did not answer that. She only picked the knife back up and went on slicing rhubarb, though her mind was no longer on the pie at all, but on the dim front room with its nailed curtains, and on the quiet, careful way Clarence Monroe moved through his own house, as though there were places in it he had long ago decided not to look at too closely. That night at supper, she found herself watching him in a different light. He ate the way he did everything. She was coming to see, with a kind of contained economy, as though he had trained himself out of taking up more space than was strictly necessary. He asked after her day. She told him about the pie, about Delphine's visit, though she did not mention what Delphine had told her. He nodded and said Delphine Prout could talk the ears off a mule, and it was best not to take everything she said as gospel. And Fannie, watching his face for some sign that he suspected what she now knew, saw nothing there but tiredness and the particular loneliness of a man eating supper across from a stranger he had promised to spend his life with. Clarence, she said before she had quite decided to say it, why is the front window shuttered? His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For a moment he did not answer, and the silence stretched long enough that Fannie began to regret asking at all. It is nothing you need concern yourself with, he said finally, and set the fork down. It is only a room I do not use. It is the front room, she said gently. It seems a poor use of a good window shut up like that. Fannie. It was the first time he had said her Christian name since the wedding, and something in the way he said it, low and worn, made her go quiet. There are things in this house that are mine to carry. I do not ask you to carry them with me. I only ask that you let me carry them in my own way. I am your wife, she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. I did not come here only to cook and to keep your accounts, Mr. Monroe. If I am to live in this house, I would like to understand it. You will understand it in time, he said, and there was something almost pleading in the way he said it, a rawness she had not expected from a man who otherwise kept himself so carefully shuttered. I am asking you for time, Fannie. That is all. She looked at him a long moment across the table, at the tired lines around his eyes, the gray that had come too early to his temples, and something in her, some part of her that had buried her own father only months before and knew the particular weight of grief that did not want to be handled by strangers, softened toward him. All right, she said. Time then. But Clarence, a house needs its windows open sometime, or the air inside it goes stale. He did not answer that, but he did not argue it either, and she understood that for the moment, this was the closest thing to agreement she was likely to get from him. The days that followed fell into a kind of rhythm that surprised Fannie with how quickly it came to feel natural. She rose before dawn, as she had always done in her father's house, and had the stove lit and coffee brewing before Clarence came in from the barn, smelling of hay and horse and cold morning air. Little Bird Woman came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and though her English was limited and Fannie's Cheyenne non-existent, the two women developed a working language of gesture and patience that let them share the kitchen without much friction. Fannie learned, in bits and pieces, that Little Bird Woman's people had once ranged over the very hills where Clarence's cattle now grazed, before the treaties and the soldiers and the slow, grinding push of the railroad had narrowed their world to a fraction of what it had been. She learned this not from Clarence, who spoke of such things rarely, but from Little Bird Woman herself, in the careful, dignified way she explained it one afternoon while they worked bread dough side by side, and Fannie found herself ashamed of how little thought she had given, in all her own hardship, to those who had lost far more than a dry goods store and a father's good name. "It is not right," Fannie said when Little Bird Woman finished. "What was done to your people, I am sorry for it, even though it was not my hand that did it." Little Bird Woman looked at her a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her dark eyes, and then she nodded once, a small, grave acknowledgement, and went back to kneading the dough. It was not forgiveness exactly, and Fannie did not expect it to be. But it was something, a thread strung between two women who had each, in their own way, been asked to build a life on ground that had not been chosen for them. And Fannie held onto that thread in the weeks that followed, letting it steady her when the loneliness of the ranch pressed in too close. She learned the rhythms of the cattle, learned to tell Clarence's good moods from his bad ones by the set of his shoulders when he came in from the range, learned that he took his coffee black and his eggs hard, and that he had a way of humming, low and almost inaudible, some old hymn tune while he mended harness on the porch in the evenings, as though he did not know he was doing it. She learned, too, the particular ache of nights spent alone in the small back bedroom, listening to him moving about in his own room across the hall, close enough that she could hear the creak of his bed frame and the low murmur of whatever restless dreams disturbed his sleep, and far enough that a whole ocean might have separated them for all the closeness they shared. And every day, morning and evening, she passed the shuttered front room, and every day the curtains stayed nailed shut, and the dusk gathered a little thicker on the sill outside where no draught ever came to stir it. It was on her 12th morning in the house, a Saturday, that she woke before first light with a restlessness she could not name and could not shake, and instead of going straight to the kitchen as was her habit, she found herself standing in the front room in her nightgown and shawl, looking at the nailed curtains in the gray pre-dawn dark. She told herself afterward that she had not meant to do it, that she had only meant to look, to trace the outline of the window frame with her fingers and imagine what light might look like coming through it. But her fingers found the small iron nails Clarence had driven into the window frame to hold the curtain fabric fast, and one by one, working quietly so as not to wake him, she worked them loose with the edge of a hairpin, feeling each one give way with a small, satisfying resistance until the curtains hung free. She did not open the window itself right away. She stood a moment with her hand flat against the cold glass, listening to the house, to the wind outside, to the small sounds of a man sleeping down the hall, and something in her chest tightened with the knowledge that what she was about to do might undo whatever fragile peace had grown between them in these 12 short days. But she thought, too, of Delphine Prout's words, a dead wife's ghost still sitting in the front room, and she thought that a ghost given no light and no air would only grow larger in the dark, would fill up more and more of the house until there was no room left in it for the living. She thought of her own father, and how in the weeks after his death she had kept his study exactly as he left it, the inkwell dry, the ledger open to the last page he had written in, until one day she had understood that keeping it so was not honoring him but burying herself alive beside him, and she had finally, with shaking hands, closed the ledger and opened the study's window to let the spring air in, and had wept, and had felt, for the first time since the funeral, that she might yet go on living. She pushed the window open, It stuck at first, swollen with disuse, and she had to put her shoulder to it. But then it gave all at once with a groan of old wood and a shower of dust, and the cold morning air rushed in, and with it the first pale gray light of dawn, and the smell of grass and horses and the far-off green smell of the creek. And somewhere a meadowlark began to sing, bright and clear and utterly unconcerned with the small, quiet drama unfolding in the house below it. She heard the floorboard in the hallway creak, and she turned, her heart hammering, to find Clarence standing in the doorway of the front room in his shirt-sleeves, his hair rumpled from sleep, his face gone pale and still in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I am sorry," she said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know you asked for time and I have not given it to you, and I am sorry, Clarence, truly I am, but I could not, Fannie." His voice was rough, cracked at the edges, and he was not looking at her at all now but past her, at the window, at the light pouring through it, and falling in a long pale rectangle across the floorboards where it had not fallen in 3 years. She fell silent, bracing herself for whatever was to come, for anger or grief or the cold, quiet withdrawal she had come to recognize as his particular way of shutting a door. But he only stood there, very still, his eyes fixed on that patch of morning light, and after a long moment he crossed the room, slow, as though walking against some great weight, and stood beside her at the window, and looked out at the hills going gold and pink with the rising sun. "She used to sit right there," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, nodding to a spot beneath the window where an old rocking chair sat pushed against the wall, its cushion faded, a small work-basket still tucked beside it with a spool of thread gone brittle with age. "Every morning," said the light was good for her eyes, for her needlework. "I would find her there when I came in from the barn, humming to herself, not even looking up until I said good morning." "Clarence," Fannie began, "I am so sorry, I should not have—" "No." He shook his head slowly, and when he turned to look at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief, like a man setting down a load he had carried so long he had forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. "No, Fannie, I think you should have. I have not been able to make myself do it these 3 years. I told myself it was respect, keeping it shut up like that. But I think it was only fear. Fear that if I let the light back in, I would have to admit she was truly gone, and not just waiting somewhere in the dark for me to come find her again." Fannie did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, only reached out and took his hand, the way she might have taken the hand of a child who had woken frightened in the night, and he let her, his fingers closing around hers, rough and warm and trembling only slightly. "Thank you," he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it over the meadowlark's song, "for opening it. I do not think I could have done it myself." They stood together at the window a long while, watching the sun climb fully over the eastern hills, saying nothing more, needing to say nothing more. And when at last Fannie moved to go start the morning coffee, Clarence did not follow her at once but stayed behind in the front room, standing in the light, and she thought, though she did not turn to see it, that he might have been weeping quietly, the way a man weeps who has been given permission at last to grieve properly, out in the open, instead of in the dark corners of a shuttered room. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, he asked her to sit with him on the porch after supper instead of retiring straight to her room, and they sat together in the deepening blue dusk, watching the first stars come out, and he told her, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about Sarah. How they had married young, both of them barely 20, how she had come from a farming family in Ohio with too many daughters and not enough land to divide among them, how she had been quiet and steady, and had loved the mountains the moment she first saw them, though she had been born and raised on flat cornfields. He told her about the baby, a son, who had come 2 months early and had lived only a few hours, and how Sarah had followed him 3 days later, weakened past saving by a fever the doctor, riding 2 days from the county seat, had arrived too late to fight. "I buried them together," he said, staring out at the dark hills. "Under the cottonwood down by the creek. I go down there most Sundays still. I do not suppose that will change, and I would not ask it to." "I would not want it to," Fannie said. "A man who forgets how to grieve a wife he loved is not a man I would trust to love the next one well." He looked at her then, something searching in his gaze, as though trying to determine whether she had meant what he thought she had meant, and Fannie, feeling suddenly bold in the dark where his eyes could not quite catch the flush rising in her cheeks, did not look away. "I did not expect," he said slowly, "to feel anything at all when you stepped down off that coach. I thought I had done all my feeling 3 years ago and there was none left in me to spend. But you have a way of pushing at things I thought were shut for good, Fannie Blackwell." "Fannie Monroe," she corrected him softly, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though he had forgotten he still knew how, and the sound of it settled something warm and unfamiliar deep in her chest. The weeks that followed the opening of the window brought changes to the house that Fannie noticed slowly, the way one notices the seasons turning, a little each day until suddenly the whole world has shifted. Clarence took to eating his breakfast in the front room instead of the kitchen, seated in an old ladder-back chair pulled up near the window, and after a time he moved Sarah's old rocking chair out to the barn loft, not out of disrespect, he explained, but because he thought it deserved a place of its own rather than sitting always in another woman's morning light. He gave the work basket, with its brittle thread and rusted needles, to little bird woman, who accepted it with the same grave dignity she seemed to bring to everything, and who later returned with a new basket she had woven herself from willow reeds, offering it to Fannie without a word, a gift that Fannie understood to mean far more than its simple materials suggested. Fannie began sitting at the window herself in the mornings, mending shirts or shelling peas or simply watching the sun come up over the hills, and Clarence took to lingering near her there before he went out to the range, not speaking always, but present, the two of them sharing a silence that had none of the strained quality of those first days, and instead felt something closer to companionship, the comfortable quiet of two people who had begun, without quite naming it, to build something together. It was not without its difficulties. Clarence remained a man of few words, prone to long silences that Fannie had to learn not to mistake for coldness, and there were nights when some memory of Sarah seemed to settle over him like a shadow, and he would sit at the supper table staring at nothing, and Fannie would let him be, understanding by now that grief was not a door that closed all at once but one that eased shut slowly over years, with many small openings and closings along the way. And there were mornings when Fannie herself woke with a heaviness in her chest, thinking of her father, of the store with its bare shelves, of a life in Missouri that no longer existed and could never be gone back to. And on those mornings it was Clarence who noticed, who set a cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked, and found some small task to keep himself near her until the heaviness passed. Slowly, without either of them quite marking the day it happened, the house began to feel less like two strangers sharing a roof and more like a single household, built by two hands instead of one. Fannie planted a small garden along the south wall, and Clarence, coming in one evening from mending fence, found her on her knees in the dirt with soil under her fingernails and her bonnet fallen back off her head, and something in the sight of her there, laughing at some private thought, her cheeks flushed with sun and effort, struck him with a force that left him standing at the corral rail a long moment before he could make himself go on toward the house. He began, in small ways, to court her, though neither of them would have called it that. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the far pasture, awkward bunches of black-eyed Susans and blue flax that he set on the kitchen table without comment, and then found some reason to be elsewhere while she discovered them. He fixed the hinge on her bedroom door that had squeaked since her arrival, though she had never complained of it. He began, on the evenings when little bird woman had left a pie or a cobbler cooling on the sill, to save her the largest slice, sliding it onto her plate before she could object, and looking almost boyishly pleased when she laughed at him for it. "You are spoiling me, Clarence Monroe," she told him one such evening, and he shrugged, not quite meeting her eyes. A man ought to spoil his wife some, he said. I have been slow to learn it. I do not intend to stay slow. It was near the end of June, with the ranch deep in the business of moving cattle to summer pasture, that trouble first found them, in the shape of a man named Silas Grady, who rode up to the house one hot afternoon on a lathered horse, and asked, with more insolence than manners, to speak with the owner of the property. Fannie, who was hanging wash on the line, told him Clarence was out with the herd and would not be back before evening, and Grady, a heavy-set man with small, calculating eyes and a mustache waxed into points, looked her over in a way that made her wish she had a shotgun near to hand, though she kept her voice even and her chin up. "You'll be the new Mrs. Monroe, then," he said. "I had heard he sent east for a bride." "Well, ma'am, you tell your husband that Silas Grady come by, and that the offer on this land still stands, and it will not stand forever. Cattle prices are soft this year, and a man in debt has few enough friends left to turn to." "My husband is not in debt," Fannie said, though a small cold worm of doubt had already begun to turn in her stomach. "Ask him," Grady said, touching his hat with mock politeness, "about the loan he took out from the Bozeman Bank 2 winters back to buy breeding stock after the hard winter took half his herd. Ask him how much of it he has managed to pay down since. I expect you will find the answer more interesting than you like." He rode off before she could think of a reply, leaving her standing amid the flapping laundry with her heart pounding, and she spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of distracted worry, turning Grady's words over and over, unable to decide whether to raise the matter with Clarence or wait to see if he would raise it himself. He came in that evening later than usual, tired and dust-covered, and it was not until after supper, when they were sitting together on the porch in the long summer twilight, that Fannie found the courage to speak of it. "A man came by today," she said. "Silas Grady. He said there was an offer on this land and something about a debt to a bank in Bozeman." She watched Clarence's face go carefully still in the way it did when something troubled him deeply, and her stomach sank further, understanding that Grady had spoken truth, or near enough to it. "It is true," Clarence said finally. "The winter of '77 was hard. Lost near half the herd to cold and wolves both. I borrowed against the ranch to restock, thinking prices would hold. They have not held as well as I hoped. I have been paying it down slow, but slow is not fast enough, not with what Grady is offering the bank to buy up the note. How much do you owe?" "Near $1,100. He said it quietly, as though ashamed of the number, though Fannie, who had watched her own father's business collapse under a fraction of that sum, understood how heavy such a debt could sit on a man's chest. "I have been managing the interest. If the fall cattle sale goes well, I can pay a good portion of the principal besides. But if Grady buys the note from the bank before then, he can call the whole debt due at once, and I could not raise $1,100 by Christmas if my life depended on it." "Why would the bank sell your note to a man who only wants to take your land?" "Because Grady is offering them more for the note than they stand to make in interest from me over the next several years, and because banks care more for their own ledgers than for the men who owe them," Clarence said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "I have gone to Bozeman twice to plead with them to hold the note steady until fall. They have made me no promises." Fannie sat with this a long moment, watching the last light fade from the hills, and something in her, some part of her that had watched her own father lose everything to men exactly like Silas Grady, hardened with a resolve she had not known she possessed. "Then we will see that the fall sale goes as well as it possibly can," she said. "And in the meanwhile, we will see if there is not some other way to raise money against the debt so that Grady has less leverage to work with." "We," Clarence repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, a kind of wondering warmth, that made her look up and meet his eyes in the near dark. "We," she said firmly. "I did not come 2,000 miles to watch my husband lose his home to a man with a waxed mustache and no manners. I have kept accounts before, Clarence. Let me look at your ledgers. Perhaps there is more room to maneuver than you think." He studied her a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded, and something between them shifted in that small exchange. Some final piece of trust settling into place, and Fannie understood that she had just been given entry into a part of his life he had, until now, carried entirely alone. She spent the following days poring over Clarence's ledgers at the kitchen table by lamplight, her father's old habits of careful bookkeeping serving her well, and found, as she had suspected, small economies that could be made and small debts owed to him by neighbors that had gone uncollected out of pride or forgetfulness. She suggested he call in what was owed him by Otis Prout for the bull he had loaned out the previous spring, and Clarence, embarrassed at not having thought of it himself, rode over the next day and came back with $40 and a renewed respect for his wife's practical mind. She suggested, too, that they sell a portion of the hay crop rather than keeping all of it for winter feed, gambling that a mild autumn would let the herd graze longer on open range. And though Clarence hesitated at the risk of it, he trusted her enough by now to agree, and the gamble paid out well when the hay buyer from the railroad camp offered a better price than expected, badly needing feed for his own mule teams. Slowly through the long hot weeks of July and August, the sum they had managed to set aside against the debt grew, dollar by careful dollar, and though it was not yet enough to satisfy the whole note, it was enough, Clarence judged, to show good faith to the bank and perhaps buy them more time. It was in the midst of this striving that Fannie found herself, one August evening, standing again at the front window, watching a summer storm build over the mountains, great purple thunderheads stacking up against the fading light, and Clarence came to stand beside her, as had become their habit, and slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture that had grown natural between them over the summer months, though it had once seemed unthinkable. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For marrying you the way I did." Writing to a stranger, asking her to cross half a continent to marry a man she had never laid eyes on, offering her nothing but a shuttered house and a mountain of debt I had not the courage to mention in my letters. He shook his head. "You deserved better than that, Fannie. You deserved a courtship, flowers and dances, and a man asking properly for your hand instead of a business arrangement conducted through the mail." "Clarence Monroe," Fannie said, turning to look up at him, the storm light throwing strange colors across his face. "I have had flowers from you, and I have had a courtship, only it came after the marriage instead of before it, which I think suits us better than the ordinary way would have. I did not come here for dances. I came here because I had nothing left in Missouri, and I have found here more than I ever thought to find. A home, a garden, a husband who saves me the largest slice of pie." Her voice caught slightly. "And I think, if I am honest, that I have found something very like love, though I did not expect it and would not have believed it possible 3 months ago." He went very still at that, his arm tightening around her waist, and when he spoke his voice was rough with an emotion he was clearly fighting to master. "I love you, Fannie," he said. "I did not think I had it left in me to say those words to anyone again. I thought that part of me had died along with Sarah, but you have shown me it did not die. It was only shut up, same as this window, waiting for someone with the courage to push it open." The storm broke over the ranch that night with a violence that shook the windows in their frames, thunder rolling long and deep across the hills, lightning splitting the sky in great jagged forks, and Fannie and Clarence stood together at the front window and watched it, unafraid, her hand in his. And when at last he turned to her and kissed her, gently at first and then with a hunger 3 years and 2,000 miles in the making, she kissed him back with everything she had been too cautious to say aloud until now. They did not remain in separate rooms much longer after that. It was a quiet thing, the joining of their 2 rooms into one, accomplished without fanfare, simply the natural conclusion of a courtship that had been, as Fannie had said, conducted somewhat out of its proper order but had arrived, all the same, at exactly where it needed to be. The trouble with Silas Grady came to its head in late September, at the close of the fall cattle drive, when Clarence returned from the railhead at Miles City with the proceeds of the herd sale, a sum that, added to what they had already saved through the summer's careful economies, was enough to pay down the bulk of the debt and satisfy the bank that the note need not, after all, be sold to any outside party. Grady, informed of this by a teller who owed Clarence a favor for a good turn done some years back, rode out to the ranch one final time, his mustache drooping in the autumn drizzle, his manner considerably less confident than it had been in June. "I had thought you a man more easily broken," he said to Clarence, standing in the yard with rain dripping off his hat brim. "I had a partner this year I did not have before," Clarence said, and Fannie, watching from the porch, felt a warmth spread through her chest at the pride in his voice. "You would do well, Mr. Grady, to look elsewhere for land you might buy on the cheap. This ranch is not for sale, this year or any other." Grady left without further argument, and though Fannie half expected him to trouble them again, he did not, having apparently concluded that easier prey could be found elsewhere in the territory, and the Monroe ranch, for the first time in 3 years, entered the winter months with its debt reduced to a manageable sum and its future secured. It was a good winter, despite the cold, or perhaps because of it, the long dark evenings pressing husband and wife closer together in the warm circle of lamplight, Fannie teaching Clarence the card games her father had taught her as a girl, Clarence teaching Fannie to read the weather signs in the shape of clouds and the behavior of the cattle, both of them learning, in 100 small ways, the shape and texture of a life shared rather than merely endured. In February, Fannie began to suspect she was carrying a child, a suspicion confirmed by the doctor from the county seat who made his rounds through the territory each spring, and she told Clarence the news on a cold, clear evening, the two of them seated at the front window watching the last light fade purple and gold over snow-covered hills. He did not speak for a long moment after she told him, and Fannie, watching the emotions cross his face, feared for an instant that she had struck some old wound, some memory of the son he had lost with Sarah that this news might reopen rather than heal. But when he finally looked at her, his eyes were bright with a joy so unguarded she had never seen its like on him before. "A child," he said, wondering, as though testing the word for the first time. "Fannie, are you certain?" "The doctor is certain enough to have wagered his good watch on it," she said, laughing despite the tears standing in her own eyes now. "I am certain enough myself. I have felt it these past weeks, though I did not want to say until I was sure." He crossed the small space between them and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. And there, in the front room that had stood dark and shuttered for 3 long years and now blazed with the last light of a winter sunset, he pressed his forehead to her hands and wept, openly, the tears of a man who had thought all his joy spent and buried under a cottonwood by the creek, and had found, against every expectation, that there was more joy waiting for him yet. If only he had the courage to reach for it. "I am afraid," he admitted finally when he had mastered himself enough to speak. "I lost a son once, Fannie. I do not know that I could bear it if—" "You will not lose this one," Fannie said fiercely, though she knew, as well as he did, that no promise she made could guarantee such a thing, that the frontier took children as easily as it took grown men, that fever and difficult births and 100 other dangers stood between a woman's hopeful carrying and a living, breathing child in her arms. "But Clarence, we cannot let fear of what might be taken from us keep us from loving what we have been given. You taught me that yourself, the morning I opened that window. A shuttered heart keeps out the storms, but it keeps out the sunlight too." He looked up at her, something fierce and tender both moving across his face, and nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. "You are always right, it seems, though I will not make a habit of telling you so too often, or you will grow unbearably pleased with yourself." "Too late for that," Fannie said, and he laughed, and the sound of it, warm and unguarded, filled the front room the way the morning light filled it now, every single day without fail. The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. Fannie suffered badly in the early months with a sickness that kept her from her usual work, and Clarence, over her protests, hired a girl from town, the mercantile owner's niece, to help with the heaviest household tasks, and took to riding into Willow Creek himself each week to fetch whatever small comforts might ease her discomfort, peppermint drops and ginger root, and once, extravagantly, a length of soft blue flannel from Blackstone's mercantile that Fannie sewed, over the following months, into a small collection of gowns and blankets for the baby to come. Delphine Prout, whose gossip had once brought Fannie news of Sarah, proved in the end a genuine friend through the long months of waiting, coming often with advice gleaned from her own 5 children, and a steady stream of hand-me-down baby things that Fannie accepted gratefully, understanding by now that in a country this vast and this lonely, a woman's friendships, however they began, were worth more than gold. Little Bird Woman, too, took a particular interest in Fannie's condition, bringing herbs and teas that she promised would ease the sickness and strengthen the coming child. And though the county doctor eyed these remedies with some suspicion, Fannie found them gentler on her stomach than anything from his own black bag, and trusted, by now, the older woman's wisdom as much as she trusted anyone's in the territory. The baby came in October, a full year and some months after Fannie had first stepped down off the broken-wheeled stagecoach into a life she could not then have imagined, and the birth, though long and hard, ended well, the doctor arriving in good time this time, no fever taking hold, no complication beyond the ordinary difficulty of the thing, and when at last the child was placed in Fannie's exhausted arms, a son, red-faced and squalling with a fury that promised well for his lungs if nothing else, Clarence, who had spent the long hours of her labor pacing the porch outside in an agony of remembered fear, was called in to see him, and stood in the doorway of the bedroom weeping without. Shame at the sight of his wife and his son both living, both whole, both breathing the same crisp autumn air that came in through the front window, which stood open, as it always did now, morning and evening, rain or shine. "What will we call him?" Fannie asked, exhausted and radiant, watching her husband cross the room to kneel beside the bed and touch one careful finger to the baby's impossibly small hand. Clarence was quiet a moment, and Fannie, watching his face, understood he was thinking of another child, born too early on a hard winter night 3 years before, who had never had the chance to be given a name that would be used. "I would like to call him after your father," he said finally, "if you are willing. You have told me he was a good man, honest in his dealings even when it cost him. I think that is a fine thing for a boy to be named for." Fannie's eyes filled with tears at that, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. And so their son was named Thomas, after Thomas Blackwell, who had died in Missouri owing debts he could not pay but leaving behind in the end, a daughter who had crossed a continent and built, out of very little, a life richer than he could have imagined for her. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no years on the frontier ever were entirely free of hardship. There was a summer of drought that thinned the herd and tested their careful economies once more, though never so severely as the debt to Grady had tested them. There was a scare, when Thomas was 3, of scarlet fever moving through the county, that kept Fannie awake 3 nights running watching over her son's fitful sleep until the fever broke and left him, thank God, unmarked by it. There was the slow, grinding sorrow, some years later, of watching Little Bird Woman's people moved further still from their old lands, a reservation boundary redrawn smaller yet again by men in Washington who had never once set foot on the grass they were dividing up on paper, and Fannie, holding her own growing children close on the evening she heard the news, thought again of the injustice done to a people who had welcomed her with kindness when she had nothing and no one, and taught her own children, in the years that followed, to speak of Little Bird Woman and her family with the same respect they would give any elder, and to understand, as best young children could be made to understand such things, that the land beneath their own boots had a longer and more complicated history than the fences and cattle brands suggested, But there was joy too, far more of it than sorrow in those years. A second child came 2 years after Thomas, a daughter they named Sarah Mee, a decision Fannie herself proposed one evening at the front window, watching Clarence's face carefully for his reaction. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion she had come to recognize over the years as the particular ache of old grief meeting new joy. It seems a heavy name to give a living child, to carry a dead woman's memory into her life that way. "I do not think it is heavy," Fannie said gently. "I think it is a gift, Clarence, to be named for a woman who loved this house, who sat in this very light with her needlework and hummed to herself, who was, by every account I have ever heard, kind and steady and good. I would be glad for our daughter to carry a piece of that forward if you are willing." He had wept then too, as he had wept the day Fannie first opened the window and had agreed, and their daughter Sarah Mee grew up knowing, in the plain, unafraid way that frontier children often learned such things, that she carried the name of a woman who had come before her mother, who had loved her father first and taught him how to love before Fannie ever arrived to be loved in turn. And there was no jealousy in this knowledge, only a kind of quiet gratitude, passed down from mother to daughter, for a love story that had 2 chapters instead of 1. A third child followed, another son, named for Clarence's own long-dead father, and by the time Thomas was old enough to ride out with his father to check the herd, and Sarah Mee was old enough to help her mother in the garden along the south wall, the Monroe ranch had grown from the hard-pressed operation Fannie had first married into one of the most respected spreads in the county, its herds healthy, its debts long since cleared, its reputation, among the ranchers and townsfolk of Willow Creek, as solid as the log walls of the house itself. The town, too, had grown up around them in those years, the railroad finally reaching close enough to matter, a proper schoolhouse built where Thomas and later Sarah Mee and the younger boy learned their letters, a second church raised to serve the growing congregation, Blackstone's mercantile expanded to twice its original size. Fannie, who had arrived in Willow Creek as a stranger with $61 sewn into her hem, became in time one of the town's most respected women, sought out for her advice on everything from canning to bookkeeping, a founding member of the small subscription library that the women of the county pooled their resources to establish, a woman whose own hard beginnings had taught her never to look down on any other woman who arrived, as she once had, with little more than hope and a folded letter. Clarence, for his part, never fully lost the quiet, watchful nature that had marked him from the day Fannie first stepped down off the stagecoach, but the watchfulness had long since lost its edge of grief and settled instead into something gentler, the contentment of a man who had feared once that he had no more joy left to give or receive, and had discovered, through the stubborn, loving persistence of a woman from Missouri, that he had been wrong. He kept his Sunday visits to the cottonwood by the creek all his days, and in time Fannie began to join him there, and later still their children too, and the visits lost their solitary sorrow and became instead a kind of family ritual, a way of honoring a woman and a small unnamed son who had once lived and loved in that same house, without letting their memory cast any shadow over the living who had come after. The front window never again knew a nailed curtain or a shuttered dark. It stood open through every season the ranch saw in the years that followed, autumn light and winter frost and spring rain and summer heat all passing freely through it, and it became, in time, a kind of family joke and a family truth both, that the Monroe house always let its morning light in, no matter what storms might be brewing on the horizon beyond the hills. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Fannie and Clarence sat together at that same window, older now, their faces marked with the particular lines that came from years of sun and worry and laughter in roughly equal measure, watching their 3 children chase fireflies in the darkening yard below, Thomas nearly grown now, and helping his younger siblings catch the small glowing insects in cupped hands before releasing them again into the night. "Do you remember," Fannie said, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "The morning I opened this window, and I thought you would send me back on the very next stage." "I remember," Clarence said, his arm coming around her the way it had 100 times before and would 1,000 times more in the years still ahead of them. "I remember thinking I had married a woman entirely too bold for a man as set in his ways as I was. And what do you think now?" He was quiet a moment, watching their children in the yard, the fireflies rising like small golden sparks against the deep blue dusk, the mountains beyond gone purple and soft in the fading light, the whole wide, hard, beautiful country that had asked so much of both of them and had, in the end, given back so much more. "I think," he said finally, turning to press a kiss to her temple, "that it was the boldest and best thing anyone has ever done for me, pushing open a window I did not have the courage to open myself. I think I have loved you longer than I let myself admit, Fannie Monroe, and I expect to go on loving you a good deal longer still, until there is no more light left in either of us to let in." "That is a very fine thing to say," Fannie said, her voice thick with tears that were, this time and every time now, entirely happy ones, "for a man who once told me he did not have words to spare. You taught me to spend them," he said, "same as you taught me to spend the light. I do not intend to go back to hoarding either one, not for as long as I live." Outside, the fireflies rose higher, and the children's laughter carried clear and bright across the yard, and the wind moved through the grass in long silver waves the way it had on the very first evening Fannie Blackwell had sat on a flat gray stone beneath a lone cottonwood tree and felt, for the first time since her father's death, something that was not quite hope but was close enough to touch it. She had found in the years since far more than hope. She had found a home, a husband who had learned to love again because she had refused to let him hide from the light, 3 children who filled the once shuttered house with noise and warmth, and the particular chaos of a family well and truly lived in, and a window that stood open every single morning, gathering the sunrise the way it was always meant to, letting the whole wide golden country pour in. And every morning, without fail, before Clarence rose to see to the cattle and Fannie rose to see to the children, the two of them lay a moment longer in the growing light, listening to the meadowlarks begin their singing, grateful, each in their own quiet way, for a broken stagecoach wheel and a shuttered window, and the particular courage of a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles to push it open.